I'm with Dan Morgenstern, and we're going to talk about some people who have written about the music and made a real difference in doing that.
Okay, well, I think I had mixed feelings about critics before I became one myself, but as I've said before, I never particularly liked that term because I always thought of myself not in the sense of being somebody who criticized musicians, but somebody who tried to make them better known, make their music better known. So I was very happy when they created that jazz advocate thing in the NEA awards, and the first one to be awarded this jazz advocates prize was Nat Hentoff, and Nat was a big influence on me when I first started writing about jazz, which was when I got out of the Army and where was it? No, as a draftee, where I had spent 2 years, obligatory, and went to Brandeis University on the GI Bill. And Nat had already been someone whose writing I liked, and at that time he was still in Boston, where he had an excellent radio program on the very new thing then, which was FM. I had followed him. He wasn't with Downbeat yet. There was a magazine called Playback that he was writing for. Anyway, I always liked his, his ideas about music and the way he wrote about it. And so I became editor of the college paper at Brandeis. Big deal, at the time. The student body was not more than a little more than 700. They didn't have a graduate department yet, so big deal, but I was the editor of the paper. And I started doing some things about jazz. There were very few jazz fans among the students, but there was a handful. And of course, the first thing I wrote about was, guess what? Louis Armstrong, yes. So anyway, I did some, proselytizing for jazz, and also hooked up with George Wein, and we got to know him. With George at that time had Storyville in Boston. Storyville was an interesting operation. Storyville was on the street level, and that's where there were names like Billie Holiday, Art Tatum, everybody. Downstairs was Mahogany Hall, and that was the traditional jazz club, and that had a house band of very high quality that included Vic Dickinson, most of prominently for us, and some other very good people. For a while, the trumpeter was Doc Cheatham. There were Buzzy Druton's brother, Al Druton, was on clarinet, but Buzzy was on drums. A great drummer, Buzzy Druton, wonderful drummer. And George was on piano, and the critics liked to pick on George's piano playing. He was a very good piano player. He was excellent. I defended him in print once when somebody had written a really stupid review where they reviewed a record where George was actually the leader, would never have happened without him, and they had to put down his piano playing for no reason at all, except that he was a producer. So anyway, Mahogany Hall was fun, and I got to know George a little bit. So Art Tatum was it started with Stan Getz. It was at Storyville, and I'd asked George. I managed to there was student activities money, and most of it went to, there was classical music, so there should be something for jazz as well. I managed to squirrel some money for jazz, and so I asked George whether we could bring acts from the club out to me. He said, it's fine, you make any deal you want with them. He didn't want any part of it. The only thing is you can't have them on a Sunday, because that's when we have an afternoon session where we combine the two bands from Storyville and Mahogany Hall. So no Sunday, but anytime else, you make a deal with them and you can do it. So the first thing we had was Stan Getz, who had that great band with Bob Brookmeyer and so on. And it was nice, it was okay. Stan and I later became friendly, but we weren't at the time. So it was that, and they came and played. They played very beautifully, and then they left, and that was it. The next thing was Art Tatum, and that was something that I really, really wanted. And did I talk about that before? No. So Art was working with this trio, which was, you know, bass and guitar, which he had been doing for many, many years. And I wanted him solo. You didn't need that other stuff. And that was really only, it was on the, you know, in the image of the Nat Cole trio, which had become very popular. And it was a good way also for Art to work comfortably when you had to do, you know, 3 shows a night at a club or something. But to me, he was real, of course, not only to me, he was the great piano soloist. So I asked him, and he said right away, he said, yes, I'd love to do it, you know. So we got him, and it was a marvelous concert. I mean, we managed to get the best piano on campus, and we had a tune for sure, you know, and people came, some of the classical people. Brandeis had a very good classical faculty, and Machito, who happened to be in Boston and heard about it, came, and you know, and the concert was reviewed by Downbeat. Dom Cerulli was then their Boston man. Nice guy, Dom, beautiful guy. And the concert was wonderful. And I think I may have said this because I've said it before. Anyway, the way we drove Art back to Boston, and I was sitting with him in the back seat, and I said, Mr. Tatum, you know, I want to thank you, you know, for the beautiful concert and everything. So then he said, and that was what floored me, he said, I should thank you because this is the first time I've ever done a concert all by myself, solo concert all by myself. I'm talking, this is 1955, it's a year before he died. 1955. And he said he'd never done a solo concert by himself. What? Subconsciously, later on, that's what really got me a bit later to decide that I wanted to try to make my life and living in jazz, because I thought that that was such a shining or stinking example of what the world of jazz was like at that point. Norman Granz had presented him in concert because we're always as part of something else, this was all by himself, and he had never done it before. And I said, what? You know, it's the greatest pianist in jazz, and one of the greatest. Vladimir Horowitz thought he was a great pianist. Okay. Anyway, it was a beautiful concert, and but that was an experience. And at the same time, as I said, you know, at Storyville they used to have the downstairs band and the upstairs band play, and then they would play together at the end. And at this particular time, Sidney Bechet was downstairs and Art was upstairs. So they played together, and they played Lady Be Good, and there was, yeah, Bechet and Tatum, Jesus. Yeah. So, you know, that's really what got me started. But talking about other critics, Nat Hentoff, we brought Nat to Brandeis. I thought it would be nice to have him talk about jazz and give a little lecture about that, which he did, and he did it very well. And that was the start of our friendship, which then, of course, Nat came to New York as Downbeat's New York editor and did wonders with the magazine, which was really at a low ebb at that time. But he did interviews with Coleman Hawkins, with Lester Young. It changed the whole tone of the magazine, although he wasn't really the chief editor. That was still, I think, Jack Tracy or Don Gold in Chicago. But then Nat started the Jazz Review with Martin Williams, and I'd gotten to know Martin also. Martin was a remarkable guy. He was a very, you know, when you saw him, he could have been a model. You could have cast him in a movie as the very upright, slightly, not really upper class, but very well bred and well off. Some really straight-laced guy, like a lawyer, or you know. Anyway, Martin was not like that at all. He was really basically, although he was very reserved, and he'd been an ensign in the Navy when he started. Martin, I think, was the best of the American jazz critics as a really insightful interpreter of the music as it fit into the whole world of art, you know, because Martin was a guy who understood that what was generally referred to as popular culture was something that was a very high artistic value. He was an expert on the history of cartoons, and he really understood that, and he liked it. And when my first son Adam was born, he got me 2 dolls. I forget what that team was. They were first a cartoon, then they were also in the movies. But you know, as a but I've forgotten. It was a male and female. They were dolls. I mean, the ones that I had. Anyway, Martin wrote about stuff like that, and he saw jazz, which Albert Murray did later on too, but in a different way, because Albert did it from the black perspective, but both within, you know, American popular culture. Martin was also very good on film. He had some very interesting things to say about Griffith. So Martin was, Nat was, they were both intellectuals, but I think, you know, with all due respect to Nat, whose orientation was more, he was very politically oriented. He was very active in politics and everything. Martin was more of an intellectual in that sense. He also taught universities. He taught English, which he didn't particularly like to do, but a way to make a living. He couldn't make a living full-time in jazz at university. So Martin was a big influence on me, I think, and we became good friends too. And I inherited, Nat and Gunther Schuller had started a jazz show called The Sound of Jazz at WBAI, which was this left-wing radio station. It later became, well, it got pretty wild later on, but I inherited that, and that was really pretty much, I think Nat dropped out first, and then Martin had it by himself, and then I got it. And then Ira Gittler got it after me, and then it went out. But Martin and Nat and I had a good relationship, and Martin and Nat then started the Jazz Review, which was the first serious and only American jazz magazine, and I got to do a little writing for it. And Nat was instrumental in getting me my first assignment from Downbeat, which I think I told the story about, with Milt Jackson and Coleman Hawkins. So Martin later on got me some writing gigs and stuff. And Martin, of course, Martin took over at the Smithsonian, and that was the biggest change there because it had been in the hands of incompetence before that. And he came in and he really made a change. And then he did that wonderful anthology. He was Martin was an absolutely, he was a little bit in that way like Don DeMichael. Neither of them could stand any kind of dishonesty, underhanded stuff. That was completely out of the picture for them. They were both very upright people, and Martin, he developed an incurable cancer, and he did something that, you know, I thought was very admirable. He didn't announce it at that, but it was obviously what he was doing. He made sure he went to see all his friends, you know, to spend just an afternoon with them or something, you know, before he. And we knew that that was it, you know, but that was a very difficult thing. Anyway, Martin was, I think his stuff holds up very well. He had real insights. Whitney, whom I never got to know that well personally, although we did have, you know, we all had encounters at all these festivals and everything. Well, it would remind me sometimes to talk about the whole festival phenomenon. It's important. But Whitney and I never got to be, you know, really tight. But I wasn't that tight with Nat either, but with Martin I was pretty tight. The thing about Whitney was that he was a superb, absolutely superb interviewer. And he didn't take notes, he didn't watch, but he captured everything. He captured the tone and speech of anybody he was interviewing, and he got them to say things that they hadn't said to anybody else because he knew their music and he knew their history and he knew what he was interested in finding out about them. Whitney and I, main relationship, I mean the main point of contact between us was that when we attended a concert together or a festival, he would always ask me about tunes. What was that they were playing? You know, he did not have a good knowledge of that, but he thought I had, and the same thing held true for Gunther Schuller, who once told me that he greatly admired my knowledge of the jazz repertoire because he didn't know even the simplest, most standard tunes. With Whitney was just mainly, he knew the standards all right, but there was monk tunes and bebop tunes and stuff like that. Whitney, my son Adam went to school in Riverdale with one of Whitney's sons. So we had a little contact that parents things there. But, and of course Whitney's now widow, Nancy, is a fine painter. I have one of her things. But Whitney was also someone who, aside from his interview chops, he had very good ears, and then he was a wonderful writer. He was the best stylist among jazz critics. Really, in a sense, the only one. I try, and I've sometimes been complimented by people outside of jazz for But Whitney, perfect, beautiful. He said some nice things about me once in a while, and one of the nicest things anybody ever said was after he reviewed that huge Commodore thing, you know, which is the biggest job I ever did in terms of note writing. And he said at the end, you know, he wrote in great detail and very well about the contents, musical contents about the box. But at the end he said something like, you know, that I did something, you know, astonishing in terms of doing all this quantity, but he said that that I was particularly adept at the hybrid form of literature, which is liner notes. He called it a hybrid form. I thought that was a big compliment. Anyway, I miss Whitney's writing, you know, and I missed it. After him, the New Yorker didn't really have any impact in jazz. And it was very important to have the New Yorker so well represented. It's one of the things that added some prestige to jazz at a time when now I think jazz is, you know, there's no longer any cultural prejudice in regard to jazz, but there was. Other critics, Charles Edward Smith was already not very well when I got to know him, but I greatly admired Charlie in the early days when I started reading about jazz. He was the best of the early bunch. Although Marshall Stearns was excellent too, but Marshall didn't do as much reviewing and stuff as Charlie did. And then there were the Chicago people that I got to know and work with, and one of them, who was my associate editor for a while, was Larry Cart, who